All right, hi guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking all about taxes. Now, this topic of taxes goes hand in hand with our discussion of welfare economics. And so as a reminder, when we talked about welfare economics, we looked at two different measures for market value. We had our consumer surplus, which is the benefit that our buyers get from participating in the market, and we had our producer surplus, the benefit that our sellers get from participating in the market. And what we said when we talked about welfare is that any market is going to be considered efficient if the sum of our consumer surplus and our producer surplus are maximized in that market. So if our total welfare, our total surplus in a market is as big as it can be, then we're going to consider our market to be efficient. Now, over on the left here, I have a brief outline of the topics that we're going to cover today when we talk about taxes. The main idea that we're going to show is that when the government steps into a market and places some kind of regulation on a specific market, they might cause some harm to our consumers and our producers, which will as a result lower our total surplus. When this happens, this regulation is reducing the efficiency in our market. It's shrinking the benefit that our buyers and sellers get, and our market is no longer going to be operating at efficiency. In this case, we might say that our market is inefficient. First up, to start this discussion of taxes, we want to talk about why do we even pay taxes? So when a government imposes some kind of tax, they're doing it to raise what we call tax revenue. And tax revenue is just the money that the government earns or collects from imposing some kind of tax. What the government does is they then take this tax revenue to pay for many of the goods and services that our society needs. So tax revenue can be put towards roads, schools, public safety, things like that. Now, there's many different types of taxes that we pay in the real world. We have taxes on income, taxes that are coming straight out of your payroll check every month or every 2 weeks. We have sales tax, and we have property taxes. Now, when we talk about sales tax, this may be the one that we're most familiar with. This is the one that we see day in and day out. And the way that a sales tax is imposed is that for every dollar you spend at the store, the government is going to take some percentage of that purchase and collect it as tax revenue. So I'm here in LA County right now. Our sales tax is about 10.25%. So for every dollar that I spend at the store, the government is collecting about 10 cents, a little more off of that dollar. Now, because we want to create a simple model of taxes that's easy for us to understand and easy for us to analyze, we're going to look at a very specific type of tax. So there's another type of tax that in reality we see all the time, but maybe we just didn't know the name for it, and this is called an excise tax. And so an excise tax is a tax that's imposed only on some specific good or service. And so sometimes we call this a unit tax, or you might also see this referred to as a specific tax. And so what this excise tax is it's a flat rate fee per unit of good that is sold. The most common good that we purchase that has an excise tax implemented on it is actually gasoline. So the way that the tax on gasoline is implemented is that for every gallon of gasoline you buy, the government is collecting some set amount of money in tax revenue per gallon of gas. So the federal tax on gasoline in the US is about 18 cents per gallon. What this means is that for every gallon of gas that I buy, the government is collecting 18 cents in tax revenue off of that gallon. It doesn't matter what the price of gas was to me, they're always going to get that 18 cents per gallon. The government also commonly taxes cigarettes, nicotine products, and alcohol using this excise tax or this unit tax. And the reason we choose to study this excise tax is because it's going to make our analysis really easy. We could also study a sales tax that's collected as a percentage, but this is going to make the math a lot more complicated. And in truth, whatever we learn about taxes looking at the excise tax, that same result is going to apply to a situation where we see a sales tax. So again, like we've done in this class before, we're going to look at a simple model, and then we can take what we've learned from this really simple model and apply it to the more complex situations that we see in the real world. Now let's get some practice seeing what an excise tax looks like, and we're going to start by seeing what happens when the government chooses to put this tax directly on sellers or producers. So when a government is implementing an excise tax in the market for a specific good, they have a choice. They can either choose to collect the tax from our producers, or they can choose to collect the tax from consumers. So there's different reasons why the government might choose to tax producers or to tax consumers, but we're going to break this down, and we're going to first analyze the effects of the tax on our sellers. Then we'll see what the tax looks like on our buyers. So we're going to do this with an example market here, and that's going to be the market for gasoline. So on my x-axis, I'm measuring the quantity of gasoline sold in gallons, and on the y-axis, I'm measuring the price per gallon of gasoline. So before our tax gets implemented, our market is operating in equilibrium, so we know that this situation would be efficient, right? Because when we're operating in equilibrium with no restriction, our total surplus is going to be maximized. So at this original equilibrium, the equilibrium price for gasoline is $4 per gallon, and the equilibrium quantity of gasoline sold is 1,000 gallons of gas. Now, let's imagine that the government steps in and they decide to put a tax of $1 per gallon on our gasoline producers. Now, what this tax means is that for every gallon of gas that our producers sell, they now need to hand over $1 to the government. So what this tax does is it makes it more expensive for our sellers to produce and sell gasoline. At every single price that they could possibly sell gasoline at, it's now more costly. They have to hand over that dollar to the government. And if we think back to our original supply and demand chapter, we know that an increase in the tax is going to reduce our supply, right? And so that's exactly what's going to happen here. When the government puts in this tax on our gasoline suppliers, our supply curve is going to shift up or to the left. And so we can think about this as a leftward shift, or we can think about this as a kind of upward shift. And the reason why I'm choosing to use the word upward shift now is because what we're going to see is that this $1 tax on gasoline shifts our supply curve upward by the exact amount of the tax, by exactly $1. All right, so the government puts this tax into place to collect some tax revenue, but first, let's analyze how this tax affects our market equilibrium. So whenever we have a shift in either our supply curve or our demand curve, we know that that's going to take us to a new market equilibrium. And so for us, this is where our new supply curve is intersecting our demand curve, which is unchanged. And we see that as a result of this tax, fewer gallons of gasoline are being sold. So let's say, for instance, after the tax, only 750 gallons of gasoline are being sold. Our equilibrium quantity has decreased. At the same time, we also see that the equilibrium price for gasoline has increased. And so let's imagine that the equilibrium price for gasoline has now increased to $4.50. What this means is that for our consumers, when they go into the market to buy gasoline, now they have to pay an increased price of $4.50 per gallon. So our buyers are paying $4.50. Our sellers need to forfeit $1 per gallon to the government in taxes. And so what this means is that the price that our producers get to keep is whatever price my consumers paid minus the amount of the tax. And on our graph, that's actually given by this point here. So my consumers after the tax have to pay $4.50 per gallon. Our sellers collect that from the consumer, but they have to hand back that $1 to the government. So our sellers get to keep this $3.50 per gallon. And so the difference between the price that our consumers pay and the price that our sellers get to keep is exactly the amount of the tax. And so we can see that our supply curve has shifted up by exactly the amount of the tax. All right, so as a result of this tax, our effect on equilibrium is that our equilibrium quantity decreases, fewer gallons of gasoline are being sold. Our equilibrium price has also increased. The price that consumers pay is higher, and the price that our sellers receive is lower. So that's our effect on equilibrium. As a result of this tax, our government is also generating tax revenue, right? That's one of their main goals when they implement this policy. And the way that we're going to calculate tax revenue for this excise tax, let TR be tax revenue, is we're just going to take the amount of the tax and multiply it by the quantity that's actually being sold. So when we have this tax per unit, we can easily calculate tax revenue by just seeing how many units were sold and multiplying that by the amount of the tax. So in this example here, after our tax gets implemented, we have a $1 per unit tax, and we have 750 gallons of gasoline being sold. So our total tax revenue is $750. And we can also show this tax revenue on our graph here. And so in order to do that, now we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about the welfare effects of this tax. So I told you that this tax is going to make our market less efficient, but let's see our consumer surplus and our producer surplus before and after the tax so that we can confirm that this is true. All right, so now we're going to start analyzing our welfare in this market for gasoline before the tax got put into place. Then we'll compare that to our welfare after the tax and see how things have changed. I will warn you, this graph is going to get a little bit messy, so please take a look at the posted lecture slides for a cleaner analysis of our welfare on the graph. Okay, so first let's talk about our consumer and producer surplus before the tax. So before the tax, our market was operating at equilibrium point E1. We were looking at our original supply curve and our demand curve that has been unchanged. At this original equilibrium, our equilibrium price was $4 and 1,000 gallons of gasoline were being sold or exchanged. Now remember, our consumer surplus is always the area that is below the demand curve, above the market price, bounded by whatever quantity is being sold. And so before the tax gets put into place, this large triangle here is representing my consumer surplus. At the same time, before the tax, my producer surplus is the area that's above the supply curve, below the market price, again bounded by the quantity being exchanged. So before the tax, this bottom triangle here is my producer surplus. And so to make this a little bit easier to see, I'm going to lightly shade in these regions. So there's my consumer surplus before the tax and my producer surplus before the tax. Now, when the tax gets put into place, our supply curve is going to shift upwards or to the left by the amount of the tax. Our price paid by consumers goes up, and our price kept by producers goes down. And so because of this, our producers and our consumers both experience some loss in welfare or some reduction in their surplus. For our consumers, they're losing out on this area here when we have a loss in the number of gallons of gasoline sold. For our producers, they're losing out on this area as well. So because we have fewer gallons of gasoline being sold, we have some loss of welfare. At the same time though, now my consumers are paying a higher price. And so because they're paying a higher price, remember my consumer surplus is the area below my demand curve and above the market price, my consumers are also losing out on this area of surplus here. So my consumer surplus triangle is shrinking as a result of the tax. Same thing is true for my producers. So they were originally receiving a price of $4 per gallon. After tax, they only get to keep $3.50 per gallon. And so this is shrinking the area of my producer surplus. All right, so my new triangle for consumer surplus after the tax is everything in this area. And my new triangle for producer surplus after the tax is everything in this area. Now, like I said, we can actually show our tax revenue on this graph of our market. So remember, our tax revenue is just going to be the amount of the tax multiplied by the quantity of the good that is sold. And if we look on our graph, we can see that this distance here is the amount of our tax, right? So this distance here is the amount of our tax, and this distance here is the quantity being sold. So on our graph, this rectangle here actually represents our tax revenue being collected by the government. So if I find the area of this rectangle, I'm using the same formula that I have over here on the right, and that's going to represent my tax revenue. All right, so when the government steps in and they put this tax on sellers, what they do is they raise the price on consumers. That reduces our consumer surplus. They lower the price received by our sellers. That reduces our producer surplus. And the government kind of wedges themselves into this market as a third player to collect some tax revenue. So before the tax, our total surplus was just equal to our consumer surplus plus our producer surplus. After the tax, our total surplus must also include tax revenue. So our new total surplus is consumer surplus plus producer surplus plus the tax revenue. Now, I told you that our market would be less efficient after the tax got put into place, right? And that's actually because we have some loss in total surplus after this tax gets put into effect. And so if we look at this little tiny triangle here, this right here represents the loss in welfare. So because we have fewer units of gasoline that are being exchanged in the market, our consumers and our producers both lose out on some welfare that isn't being transferred to the government as tax revenue. And we call this our deadweight loss, or DWL. And so this is the loss in efficiency, or the loss in welfare, that is generated by this tax regulation. All right, so now we've seen the effect of a tax on producers in our gasoline market. Let's instead pivot to the other side and see how this tax might affect our market if the government instead chooses to tax our buyers or our consumers. So we're starting from the same equilibrium price of $4 per gallon, 1,000 gallons of gasoline being sold. But instead of collecting the tax directly from sellers, now the government is deciding to collect the tax from consumers. And so what this means for our consumers is that for every gallon of gasoline that they buy, now they have to hand over $1 in taxes to the government. So as a consumer, this is making gasoline more expensive, right? Instead of just paying the price that you paid before, now you have to pay an extra dollar on top of that in terms of taxes. So what this is going to do is it's going to make gasoline more expensive for our buyers at every single price, and it's going to shift our demand curve downwards or to the right. And the reason for this is because if I now have to pay $1 per gallon in taxes, I am not going to want to buy as much gasoline. This is going to push the equilibrium price for gasoline down. So we end up at a new equilibrium point in our market. Again, we have fewer gallons of gasoline being sold. And the price that buyers are now willing to pay with the tax in place is lower. They don't want to spend as much per gallon of gasoline because they know they also have to pay this tax on top of whatever price they pay. So once the tax on consumers is put into place, our buyers are only willing to pay a price of $3.50 per gallon. But this is really just the price that they're willing to hand over to the producer. Our buyers are paying $3.50 to the producer directly, but with the added tax, they are paying that $3.50 plus the amount of the tax. So the total price that is faced by our consumers with the tax is still $4.50. After that tax is paid, our producers are still just left with this $3.50. So our demand curve is shifting downward by the amount of the tax. All right, the interesting thing about this result, and maybe you don't believe me yet because I've just plugged in some numbers on this graph, but the effects of a tax on our equilibrium are going to be the exact same no matter whether the government is taxing producers or taxing consumers. So for political reasons, the government might choose to put the tax on producers or on consumers. They'll choose the option that makes them look better to their voters or their constituents, but the effect of the tax is going to be exactly the same. We still have this same reduction in the units that are sold. We have this same increase in the price that's paid by consumers, this same decrease in the price that's paid by producers. So the result of the tax is the same no matter what. This also means that the welfare effects of this tax are going to be the same no matter whether the government taxes our buyers or sellers. So we could go through the same procedure of analyzing our welfare on this graph, and we'll see that the tax generates the same reduction in consumer and producer surplus, the same amount of tax revenue, and the same deadweight loss, or that same loss in efficiency. All right, now we want to talk about something called tax incidence. And what we mean when we say tax incidence is we just want to measure the burden of a tax on a specific party. So we can look at our tax incidence on consumers or our tax incidence on producers. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to measure what proportion or what fraction of the tax is actually paid by that party. So if I want to find my tax incidence on consumers, I want to see for this $1 per gallon tax on gasoline, how much of that tax are my consumers actually paying? And so if we look here at this graph with our tax on consumers, the original market price was $4 per gallon. After the tax is put into place, our consumers are paying $4.50 per gallon. So with this tax in effect, the price on consumers rose by 50 cents. So my consumers must be paying for exactly half of the tax. So my tax incidence or my tax burden on consumers is 50%. If my consumers are paying 50% of the tax, of course my producers have to pay the other 50%, right? So once I find the tax incidence for one party, it's really easy to find the tax incidence for the other. Together, it has to add up to 100%. All of the tax has to get paid. Now, the interesting thing about tax incidence is that tax incidence is always going to be the same regardless of whether the government is putting that tax directly on consumers or directly on producers. So if you go back and look at our graph of our gasoline market with the tax on producers, you'll see that we have this same split or same share of the tax between our buyers and sellers. With the tax on producers, the price on buyers rose by 50%. With the tax on producers, the price on buyers rose by 50 cents, and the price received by sellers fell by 50 cents. So we have the same exact share of the tax burden, regardless of who is actually giving that money to the government. All right, you might be wondering, if the government taxes consumers, how come consumers aren't paying the whole tax? Or if the government taxes producers, why aren't producers paying the whole tax? And this has to do with price sensitivity. For our buyers, when this tax gets put into place, now gasoline is more expensive for them at every single price. And so that causes the market price of gasoline to fall as our demand curve shifts downward and to the left. So because the market price for gas has fallen, now our producers must accept a lower price in the market. On the other hand, if the tax was put on our producers, Our producers are not going to pay the full amount of the tax because they can pass on some of that price increase to consumers. And so this is what people are talking about when they're talking about price increases from tariffs. So tariffs are just taxes that foreign businesses must pay in order to import their products and have them sold here in the US. And economists and other people know that those producers in foreign countries aren't going to be willing to pay the entire amount of the tariff themselves or the entire amount of that tax themselves. So they pay some of it, but they increase the price of their final product so that they can get their consumers to help them out and pay for some of that tax or that price increase. The last thing we want to talk about here in this section is how our tax incidence and deadweight loss actually vary depending on the elasticity of demand. So previously I told you guys that the tax incidence on consumers and producers depends on their price sensitivities. And so when our demand is more inelastic, consumers' quantity demanded is relatively unresponsive to a change in price. Even when the price goes up due to something like a tax, consumers are still going to buy relatively the same amount. There's not going to be a huge reduction in the quantity that they choose to purchase. And so because of this, the more inelastic demand is, the greater the tax burden or tax incidence will be on consumers, and the smaller the deadweight loss will be. Firstly, the tax incidence on consumers will be greater because producers can get away with raising the price on their consumers to get them to pay a larger share of the tax. If our consumers are very insensitive to price changes, then producers know they can get away with raising the price on their customers. Secondly, the deadweight loss generated with inelastic demand is going to be smaller because we have a smaller reduction in the quantity that's being bought and sold in the market. So the deadweight loss is generated when we have a reduction in our equilibrium quantity after a tax is put into place. But when demand is very inelastic, consumers are going to buy almost the same amount no matter what, even when the price goes up. So we're going to have a smaller reduction in our quantity bought and sold, and therefore a smaller deadweight loss. So we actually have three cases that we can compare in terms of our tax incidence and deadweight loss, depending on the elasticity of demand. When demand is perfectly inelastic, the entire tax incidence or tax burden is going to fall on consumers, but there will be no deadweight loss generated. This is when we have that perfectly vertical demand curve. The tax is going to be paid entirely by consumers, but there's no reduction in the quantity sold, so there's no deadweight loss. As demand becomes more elastic, so as our demand curve starts to become flatter and flatter, the burden of the tax is going to start to fall more on our producers. So this is where we get a more even split of tax incidence between our buyers and our sellers. However, in this case, there is some deadweight loss generated. Because our consumers are sensitive to changes in price, they are going to reduce their quantity demanded when they're faced with a price increase, and that's going to create a deadweight loss, some reduction in the number of units sold in the market. Lastly, if our demand is perfectly elastic, so we have a horizontal demand curve, the entire burden of the tax is going to fall on our producers. So in this case, consumers don't pay any of the tax, all of the tax is borne by our producers, but there's going to be a very large deadweight loss generated in this situation. And this is because when demand is perfectly elastic, consumers are extremely sensitive to the price change. Even if the price of the good just goes up by a little bit, now they don't want to buy anything. So we have a potential to create a very large deadweight loss in this situation.